Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some wolves. On this episode, we are thrilled to have with us here in the state of California, but via Zoom, Amaroq Weiss, the senior West Coast wolf advocate. She's been with the Center for Biological Diversity for 23 years this month. We were just discussing before we recorded. Amaroq, such a pleasure to have you on with myself and Stephen. How's everything going by you?
Things are okay. It's nice to be here with you. And I've been doing wolf work for 23 years, but I've been with the Center for Biological Diversity for the last 8. So just clearing that up, but it's all been fabulous work working with amazing colleagues on an amazing species. And so, yeah, it's a beautiful day here in Northern California.
Awesome. And obviously, our best wishes go out to you, your husband, and your 2 huskies, that you guys are safe and happy and healthy and well up there with everything that's going on. Just give everybody who's listening a background, because I was reading up on you. You were a former lawyer and you've been doing this work for 23 years. So how did you get started with helping to advocate for wolves and settling here in the western part of the United States? Because you work on issues ranging all the way from Alaska, the Rockies, and here in the Pacific on the western side. So how did you get started with that?
I'm actually originally from the Midwest. I grew up in Iowa, where we had, as I learned growing up, once upon a time, amazing prairies that were covered with bison and wolves and grizzly bears. But by the time I was growing up there, none of those things existed anymore. I was always one of those kids that if my parents couldn't find me for dinner, I was either up in someone's tree or in the creek at the park or in somebody else's backyard with their dog if we didn't have a dog at the time. And so that's always been something I've been really drawn to and felt a part of. As I grew up, when I went to school, I became a biologist first. I have a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science actually in entomology, which is basically a biologist with a specialist in insects. And I gravitated that way because it was one of the first fields in biology that was really integrating this whole concept of it's not just about the insects. It's about the plants that they live on. It's about the forest where the plants grow in, and it's about the other organisms that they interact with. It was really the only biological field 40 years ago that I could see was starting to put this tapestry together of it's all important together. You remove one piece of it and the other piece of it start to unravel. And so I got those degrees and I was planning on becoming an environmental attorney, because in the Midwest, we had huge problems with groundwater pollution from all the pesticides that were being used to kill insects. So I went to law school, came out to California to go to law school because they had a great program with a lot of opportunities to do actual live work with clients at the school I went to, University of California, Hastings College of the Law in San Francisco. But I started talking to environmental attorneys, and I learned that most of them sat at their desks and read code books and read case law all day. And I wanted to be in court arguing. I wanted to be litigating. And so I actually changed courses and became a criminal defense attorney for 10 years. I worked for a private firm. I worked for the Federal Public Defender's Office. I then became an appellate attorney, arguing appellate cases at state and federal levels, where I got to argue before a judge to convince them why my side is correct and why my opponent's side lacks merit. And as I was reaching 10 years of law practice, I transitioned to wolf work for a couple of reasons. First of all, as I mentioned, I'd always loved dogs, but I'd also always loved all kinds of canines. My mom tells me that when I was 4, I walked into the living room one day and said, I'm never having babies, I'm only having puppies. And so there's that piece. And I kept my word on that. And then second, I had the educational background and the work experience that allowed me to understand the science, the law, the policy making around wolf conservation and recovery. And then I read two books that were really, really instrumental in making me make this switch. One of them was back in college. Right after the book came out, I read Barry Lopez's book of Wolves and Men, which relates not only what wolves are all about and their behavior and their biology, but this incredible history of persecution of this species that has followed it and has particularly been placed on its back in this country. And my interest in pursuing justice was a natural transition for wolves. Then the other book I read right after it came out too, in 1995, 1996, Hank Fisher wrote a book called Wolf Wars, which describes the 20-year political battle that it took to get wolves restored to Yellowstone in central Idaho 20 years after they were first listed on the Federal Endangered Species Act. And so putting those things together, about the same time I learned about the California Wolf Center, which used to be called the Julian Wolf Preserve out in eastern San Diego County. And I lived in San Diego at the time. And I drove out there one day and said, I'm a biologist, I'm a lawyer, I love wolves, how can I help you? And they put me to work giving talks about the various lawsuits that were happening at the time to try by groups to get wolves yanked out of Yellowstone. The case was up on appeal at the time. So that was the start of it for me. And from there, I transitioned into working with other organizations. I worked for Defenders of Wildlife for 8 years. For about 5 years, I did independent contractor work for the California Wolf Center, the Mexican Wolf Conservation Fund, Defenders of Wildlife, and then I got hired by the Center for Biological Diversity. And it's just been a long, incredible journey of opportunity to advocate for a species that deserves it so much, and that so many people care about. And so, and I can remember trying to get into wolf work. I can remember calling one of my old entomology professors and saying, how do I do this? And he said, oh, I don't know how you're going to be able to do that. Everybody wants to do wolf work. I don't know how you're going to do that. And I just found a way. And so I think for anybody that wants to do this work, you just keep looking and you just keep knocking on doors and you just keep showing up and you'll find a way.
That's an incredible journey. I mean, man, there was just a whole lot going on there. And that's what you said at the end is one of those questions that we asked. We had Jim Halfpenny on the podcast probably a month ago now. So Jim Halfpenny and Leo Leckie, who's a colleague that we both share and we both know, that it's the same thing that they always say. They go, if you really want to do this work, there's ways to get into it, but you got to show up. Yeah. And you really got to, and you've
the Halfpenny, he literally said, well, come on out to Yellowstone. He just meant show up, over and over again. You can find your way.
But it's phenomenal. I can't thank you just for, that you getting to where you are now is just phenomenal. That's such a great journey there. I want to jump in because you've done all this advocacy work out here, and you've been studying the law, and you work for work with the federal and state statutes. So if we can start in California, our home state. So what's been going on with some of the protections and some of the management plans here in California? I spoke with Leo. Gosh, it was a little while ago, and I was reading up about the Lassen Pack, which is this pack. I believe it's in northeastern California, more towards the eastern part of the state, and they've had 4 years of successful breeding. Has there been any talk of protection for those wolves, or any reintroduction plans that have been going on in California? Where does that stand as of right now that you can speak to?
Probably most of your listeners, if they're interested in wolves, already know about Wolf OR7, but I'll start there because that is the path that tells the story of why we have wolf management plans and why we have protections here in the state now. So when OR7 came into California from Oregon in late December of 2011, the State Wildlife Agency here, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, realized that more wolves would probably be coming. In fact, they'd even already started to write just the basic report on wolves in the previous 2 years, knowing they'd have to throw something up on their website right away the first time a wolf was confirmed back here. And that's in fact what they did. That's one of our dogs contributing to the conversation. So they got that report up, but they started to pull together a stakeholder group of people that would help advise the agency on what should go into a California wolf conservation and management plan. But even before they could really get rolling on that, my organization and 3 others realized wolves are federally protected in California, is endangered under the Federal Endangered Species Act, and they still currently are, although that's in jeopardy. But at the time OR7 came in, they were not state protected. And so my organization and 3 others filed an administrative petition, just like a legal brief, with the State Wildlife Commission. And we urged them to list the gray wolf under California's own State Endangered Species Act. And that took about 2 years worth of hearings, different reports prepared by the agency, different arguments, oral arguments made by folks like me and other members of the public. And 2 years later, in June of 2014, the commission did vote to list wolves under the California State Endangered Species Act. There's some more process that has to happen. So the listing actually became finalized in January of 2017. So wolves in California, even from the moment that we petitioned, within like about 8 months, once they became a candidate species, wolves received full State Endangered Species Act protections. And the State Endangered Species Act in California is as protective as the Federal Endangered Species Act. In many respects, and in some respects, it's a little more protective. And so what that means is that wolves in California can't be killed except in defense of human life. So they can't be killed here, say, for livestock conflicts. Instead, the agency needs to rely on using non-lethal measures. We can talk about that a little bit more. But so for anyone that's wondering, currently in California, wolves are fully protected as endangered under both the federal and the State Endangered Species Act. As far as the wolf plan goes, the agency then spent a couple of years holding stakeholder meetings. I was one of the representatives in that stakeholder group to advise the agency. There were multiple meetings over about 2 years, 3 years. The agency put out a draft plan for the public to review. And then in December of 2016, the agency released the final California Wolf Conservation Plan. So that's up on the agency's website for folks to read. It's in 2 parts. Part 1 is about 30 pages, kind of an overview of everything. Part 2 is about 300, 350 pages. It's really got the nuts and bolts of the plan if you want to dive into different chapters and see what those various sections are. And I think we're probably going to talk about some of the other states' wolf plans here on the West Coast, but just to distinguish them, in California, the state wolf plan does not divide the state up into different recovery zones, which is what Oregon and Washington does. Instead, what the California plan did was it created a map of where there is suitable habitat for wolves. And this is done through a scientific process called modeling, where they take maps of forest cover, which becomes a surrogate for where there's probably prey, deer and elk. They take a map of road density because wolves do better in places where there's fewer roads. They do a map of, say, where there is human activity, population centers or livestock operations. And they lay these maps over each other, and then you come up with a map where everything meshes where it's the best habitat for wolves. So what the plan shows is there are about, I think it's 23,000 or 26,000 square miles of habitat that's good for wolves in the state. Most of it is in far northern California, northeastern California, coming down into the Sierra, into the southern Sierra even. They developed a predictive model of how many wolves this habitat could support. And excluding the southern Sierra, I think their modeling shows anywhere from 371 to 497 wolves. So up to around 500 wolves, not including the southern Sierra. And then it incorporates this adaptive management approach over 3 phases. And this is fairly common for wildlife management. because you want to recognize that as the population increases in size, your management tools may change. Your conservation measures may change from working with a very low population to a much higher, more robust, healthy population of animals. So California's plan has 3 phases. And in phase 1, we're seeking to get to 4 successful breeding pairs of wolves for 2 consecutive years. Phase 2, you're trying to get to 8 successful breeding pairs for 2 consecutive years. And then after that, you're in phase 3. There's no population cap, which is great. I guess I would say the one thing that conservation groups really do still have concerns about is we think that those phases set too low of goals. We'd like to see more successful breeding pairs before you switch from one phase to the next. And we'd like to see those periods of time be for more than 2 consecutive years, because that's not really enough time to know, is that population going to stay there? Is it continuing on an upward trajectory? Could the population decline? We'd like to see there be more of a buffer before you move from one phase to the next. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the great things about the California Endangered Species Act is that at such low numbers of wolves as we have now and will have for the foreseeable future, wolves cannot be killed except in the defense of human life.
Wow. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to ask, because I spend a lot of time in the Southern Sierra, and I was really curious about what the plausibility is that we will see a sustainable wolf population there. And that's really personally exciting. And that seems like a realistic projection that in the Southern Sierra, we would see sustainable wolf populations.
Their modeling shows that the habitat there is suitable for wolves. So the question is, can they get there? And can they get there in sufficient numbers to find each other to establish packs? And, one of the things we saw recently with wolf OR54, who is one of OR7's offspring, he went back to Oregon eventually and ended up finding a mate there, and then had offspring for the next 5 years. Several of his offspring have come to California, but one of them, OR54 in particular, made it all the way down to Sierra County and Nevada County, even briefly dipped across the border into Washoe County in Nevada and the Tahoe Basin before coming back into California. So she is the southernmost known travels by a wolf since wolves have started to come back to the state.
Wow, that's really exciting. And with all the you were talking about legislation a lot. I'm just wondering if, as a summary to sort of paint a picture of the structure of this whole process, can you describe for everyone, currently at least, when it comes to wolf legislation, who are sort of the regular players? Who are the parties involved in the conversation day to day? Who needs to be convinced of what? Who wants to see what happening?
So it depends on if you're talking about at the federal or the state level. Let's just talk for a moment about wolves writ large at the federal level in the United States, because that's really going to play a big role on whether or not we'll see wolves recovered in more places and what California's wolf population trajectory will be like. So many of your listeners may already know wolves were listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act in 1974, a year after that act was adopted by Congress. What that did was protect wolves from being killed throughout the lower 48. Wolves were listed as endangered throughout most of the lower 48. In Minnesota, they were listed as threatened, which is a slightly lesser protective level, and that's because by the time they were listed, Minnesota is the only state in the lower 48 that even still had a wolf population. We had totally wiped them out throughout the rest of the country. And that's saying a lot because when Europeans first came here, there were about 2 million wolves across all of North America, and in the western United States and Mexico alone, they're estimated to have been about 380,000 wolves. So by the time the Endangered Species Act was passed in 73, we had less than 1,000 wolves left in Minnesota, and that was it. So you would think once wolves were federally listed under the Endangered Species Act, since the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service now had a duty to try to recover the species, You would think that they would try to recover them in all the places throughout the lower 48 where there might still be suitable wolf habitat, but they didn't do that. They instead picked 3 key areas to focus on. The Western Great Lakes states, so Minnesota and then the neighboring states of Michigan and Wisconsin, the Northern Rockies, which is Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, and then the Southwest, Arizona and New Mexico. And these are the only 3 places that they have tried to recover the gray wolf species. And the efforts in Minnesota were successful to the extent that they didn't have to reintroduce wolves there. There already was this small population. Just prohibiting people from killing them allowed that population to grow in number and expand in territory into adjacent Wisconsin and Michigan. So today in that 3-state area, there's about 4,000 wolves total. In the Northern Rockies, wolves started to come over from British Columbia into northwestern Montana in the late 70s, early 80s, but they could never make it further south because people kept killing them. And in part because of that, and because wolf populations were no longer found in Idaho or Wyoming or the rest of Montana, the reintroduction effort took place in which wolves were captured in British Columbia and Alberta and brought to Yellowstone National Park, which borders parts of Wyoming and Montana, and central Idaho. So wolves were also reintroduced to the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness in central Idaho. And only a few wolves were reintroduced, 31 in Yellowstone, 35 in central Idaho over a 2-year period, 95, 96. And those populations then were able to grow in size and expand out more across those states plus Montana. So today it's hard to say whether or not there's maybe like 1,500 to 2,000 wolves there. And the reason it's hard to say is that states there have since taken over wolf management and they're not good at letting the public know what their current wolf populations are. And since they lost federal protections there, they've been engaging in really aggressive hunting and trapping seasons. So 1,500 to 2,000 wolves there, probably closer to 1,500. In the Southwest, the Mexican gray wolf recovery program consisted of capturing the last 7 known wolves in Mexico. The Mexican gray wolf is the most highly endangered subspecies of gray wolf, bringing them into a captive breeding program and starting to release them and reintroduce them in 1998. And today, I think there's maybe about 140 Mexican gray wolves in the wild. So that hasn't done nearly as well as the Northern Rockies population. A lot of wolves have been illegally killed there. The federal agency hasn't been good about the recovery policies and practices there. So as a result, today we've got maybe 6,000 wolves in the lower 48, and that's about 1% of their former numbers and about 10% of their former range. But we know that there's way more good wolf habitat where they could be recovered. So we've had a couple things that constantly happen with wolves across the country. One is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service bows to the political pressure of the livestock industry and the sports hunting industry and seeks to prematurely strip wolves of the Endangered Species Act protections, either in parts of the country or across the whole country. And then while they're doing that, members of Congress, particularly Republican members of Congress, but not strictly all Republicans, introduce legislation at the federal level to try to strip wolves of protection as well. And this actually happened in 2011. Unfortunately, Congress was successful in doing that, and they stripped protections from wolves in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, the eastern 1/3 of Oregon, the eastern 1/3 of Washington, and a little notch out of north central Utah. So those portions of those states and those other 3 full states, wolves are under full state management there. And we've seen really bad things happen to wolves as a result. Right now, there is another proposal pending by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to strip wolves of protections throughout almost the entire rest of the lower 48, except for the Mexican wolf area. And if that happened, here in California, wolves would lose all federal protections. They'd still have the state protections, thank goodness. But it also means that wolves in neighboring Oregon would lose all federal protections in the remaining 2/3 of the state where they still have that. And that will impact the California population. That will mean that the agency in Oregon now has authority to also kill wolves for livestock conflicts not just in Eastern Oregon, but the rest of the state. And that will have an impact on wolf ability to make their way into California. So in terms of the most critical impacts for wolves in California, it's really what's happening at the federal level and how that could affect our source population.
Because when we were speaking, we spoke to Jim Halfpenny about this too. I want to get your thoughts on this as well. What do you feel the major push to go after wolves federally? And I know there's push from multiple different from ranching, from hunting. There's a couple different ways to look at it, but why in the court of public opinion, what is the need to really eradicate this particular species that it seemed to really carry over from? You could look at any carnivore and pick one just because of whatever it is, a myth, a legend, things that have come down from over hundreds of years that these animals are bad. But why specifically do you believe that this is an animal that has consistently been really in the bullseye of a lot of political agendas for people, for Congress at the federal level to not come up with a plan to be able to recover the species non-lethally?
If we went with the court of public opinion, wolves would have full protection for a long time to come. Just want to make that note that if anything, more Americans support wolf recovery than ever before. And just to give you an example of that, back in the early 2000s when U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service first tried to strip wolves of protections, I can remember that public comment period where they put out the draft and the public gets to comment, and they received 95,000 comments from the public. 90 to 95% of them were opposed to stripping wolves of protection. Okay, so this is in the early 2000s, 95,000 public comments. Last year, when they again proposed to strip wolves of protections, we got over 1.8 million comments from the public opposed to stripping wolves of protections. So if anything, the court of public opinion is that wolves are something we want. The unfortunate thing is that the people that are in charge of making decisions are not listening to the court of public opinion. They also aren't listening to the scientists who teach us all, including people who don't even know that much about wolves, but now understand how important top predators are for healthy ecosystems, which we all need. The folks that are putting the pressure to strip wolves of protection and go back to days that we're seeing in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming of killing wolves in mass numbers are in large part those entities that do not like federal or state regulation of business or of their lives. The wolf has become a surrogate for people's opposition to government telling them what they can and can't do. There are many people who really don't care whether it's the wolf or what it is. It might be another endangered species. It's the action of the government saying this animal is protected. We need to take care of it. There are certain activities we're no longer going to do so that we can make sure that this animal survives. And the wolf carries that on its back. So that's where you end up getting things like the Koch brothers, who are very influential in funding corporate interests and funding conservative interests, creating organizations like Americans for Prosperity, and then creating chapters at the local level like Californians for Prosperity or Utahns for Prosperity, so that people think that these are homegrown grassroots groups who are just trying to preserve their way of life. But in fact, they're funded behind the scenes by these large mega billionaires who want to see government out, regulation out. They want to be able to drill for oil and gas on public lands. They want to be able to allow private for-profit livestock industries to make their living off our public lands and have our public wildlife killed on their behalf. So they're actually pretty large entities in the background who are helping push this agenda. It's not just your small town farmer. It's not just your small town hunter. And in fact, a lot of those people are actually willing to live with wildlife. I know a lot of ranchers who don't like to see anything dead, whether it's wildlife or their livestock. I know a number of hunters who they don't want to kill wolves. And in fact, they find it exciting to go out hunting for deer, knowing that there's also a wolf out there looking for the same prey. So it's hard for the general public to, I think, tease out all of that information, but it's much bigger than one would think.
Yeah. And we got the same sentiment when we spoke to others that, like you said, there are individuals on the other side, hunters and ranchers, that are naturalists and they want the natural world. I think that was one thing that we've encountered a couple times already. And we've only done, 15 or so episodes, but the individuals that we've had on is there are a lot of people on both sides that want the natural world. It's not just one side versus the other. And I think that's something that hopefully we can try and bridge is that both sides want this. There are people on both sides and there can be a middle ground. And that's, I think, a little bit of what we're trying to do is trying to bridge that gap. But thanks for trying to, like you said, get everything out in the open so we can figure it out. If you don't mind, I do want to go to the next state that you're really in partner with, and that's Oregon, where OR7 and a lot of these other wolves have come down into California. Really the same as we were talking about with California. What are sort of the status and the plans and the efforts going on in Oregon that are there to protect? Is it the same with California, or do they have a state Protection Act for wolves up in Oregon as strong as the federal, or what's the difference up in Oregon as opposed to California?
Great question. I think probably most of the public doesn't realize that most states have their own state endangered species act. I think something like 46 or 47 of the states do. But many of those state acts are barely protective. Like they allow for the listing of the species, but then they don't require a recovery plan. Or they allow the listing, and that means it's prohibited to kill the species, but then they don't enforce any other kind of safeguards about it. I think that California's is the most protective. Oregon's is not nearly as protective. And when we get into Washington, that's even less protective. Oregon does have a state endangered species act. And what a number of states did when wolves were federally listed, not just when wolves were federally listed, but when any state enacted its own state endangered species act, what they did was they simply grandfathered onto their own list any wolves that were already listed by the feds that were once native to Oregon or their own state. And that's exactly what happened with the wolf. So when Oregon passed its own state endangered species act, they grandfathered in species, including the wolf, even though they hadn't had wolves there for decades and didn't have any wolves coming back for a couple more decades. I think their act was passed sometime in the 80s. I'm not sure. So when they first started getting wolves was 1999. B45, a wolf. Well, actually, let's start back. Oregon was actually founded because of wolves, kind of. The Oregon Territory, which consists of Oregon and Washington and some other things that weren't really states yet, started holding meetings, bringing people together to enact a wolf bounty, when in fact what the people holding the meeting were actually wanting to do was to develop a provisional government and found a state. And so I always maintain that Oregon's flag should have a wolf on it, not a beaver, although beavers are pretty cool too. And they're great ecosystem engineers too. The last known wolf in Oregon was killed in 1947, brought in for a bounty payment in Western Oregon. A lot of times that's how we know when the last wolves were around, is from these bounty payment records from various counties. So in 1999, a wolf walked into Oregon from, I shouldn't say she walked. She swam the Snake River. She scaled the 10,000-foot peaks of Hell's Canyon. She didn't walk. She did wolf travel. And she was one of the offspring or grand offspring of some of the wolves that were reintroduced to Idaho back in 95 and 96. So 99, she comes across the border. The state of Oregon doesn't even know that wolves are on their own state endangered species list. They freak out. They demand that the feds take their wolf back. And so if they'd known it was on their list, they would have known they couldn't ask the feds to do that they had to protect the wolf and leave it there. So the feds flew over and they captured her and they took her back to Idaho. I think in 24 hours, she traveled like another 70 miles back towards Oregon, but she ended up staying in Idaho. And over the few next years, a couple more wolves came in. And unfortunately, they were found illegally killed or one was hit by a vehicle. And so by 2003, the state decided that it would develop its own wolf conservation and wolf management plan, realizing more wolves are probably coming. I lived in Oregon at the time, so I got to be on that stakeholder group too, which is cool to have the opportunity to see how different states do things differently. And so we worked together for about 2 years. In 2005, Oregon released its wolf management plan. And unlike California, the Oregon Wolf Management Plan does divide the state into regions. It divides the state in half and east to west, with the recognition that wolves are probably going to fill up the east side first before they get to the west side, just because the source population is coming from Idaho. And so their first wolf pack was not confirmed until 2008, 3 years after they had created their wolf plan. And this wolf plan, like California's, also is a phased adaptive management approach. So it has a phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And each half of the state is supposed to meet those phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 goals. And so for each half of the state to get to phase 1, they want to have 4 successful breeding pairs for 3 consecutive years. To get to phase 2, they want to have 7 successful breeding pairs for 3 consecutive years. And then phase 3 is anything above 7, and you don't want it to go below 7. So that's for each half of the state. So it's actually not 4 and 7, but 8 and 14. But realizing they would reach those goals on the east side long before they'd reach them on the west side. So the plan was originally well followed by the state, but then in 2011, right after wolves got federally delisted in the eastern portion of the state, they got a lot of pressure from the livestock industry to start killing wolves quickly if there were livestock predations. And so we and 2 other groups sued the state. And as a result of that, got a settlement that got much more protective measures for wolves in that early phase 1 stage. Then the next thing that happened in Oregon was in 2015, the state prematurely delisted wolves from the State Endangered Species Act. The only silver lining to Oregon's situation there is because of the wolf plan with the state division in half, even though they were delisted statewide, under the wolf plan, the agency was still required to treat wolves in the western side as if they were still state listed until they meet those higher goals. And so fortunately, the agency there has been much more judicious than the state of Washington, which we'll get to next, in its treatment of wolves. Oregon has had at least as many livestock conflicts as Washington has, which overall is not many, but they get blown out of proportion. But still, Oregon has killed less than half as many wolves as Washington has. So the wolf plan there has worked better for wolves, and the people in place have been, as I said, more judicious in their understanding that wolves need stronger protections, even if the agency does have the ability to kill wolves, but it's something to keep an eye on. One of the other things that happened in Oregon recently is the wolf plan was updated in 2019, and the commission that updated the plan kept in place some provisions that could open the door to wolf hunting and trapping in Oregon, which we are hoping does not happen and are keeping a good eye on to alert citizens if any kind of action is needed. So in Oregon, the agency puts out an annual report every spring, and it tells you what the wolf population was as of the end of December, the year before. So the report that came out this spring showed that in Oregon, there were 158 wolves in 22 packs. 19 of those had successful breeding pairs. And if that sounds like a lot of wolves, just to put it in perspective, the analysis that has been done shows that Oregon can actually support up to 1,400 wolves. And right now, the wolves that are there only living in about 12% of identified suitable habitat. So Oregon could still fill up with a lot more wolves. So we're still in the early stages of recovery there, even if some folks like to say, oh, well, Oregon's doing great. You know, they're recovered. We don't view them as recovered. They got ways to go.
Yeah, and there's a wolf from Oregon, I think it was OR 59, that I saw your name was associated with on Google, and it mentioned poaching, and I was wondering if there was a resolution in that case, and also if you could speak to poaching in Oregon or California or Washington, if that's like a real threat to the success of this goal.
Yeah, poaching is a threat for wolves anywhere. You know, first of all, any place wolves live that they don't have full protections from humans killing them. Human-caused mortality is the leading cause of mortality. The next leading cause would be inter-pack strife, battles with each other's packs, to maintain their own territory. But so human-caused mortality is a big threat. And we know from science research that's been done that for every poached wolf that is found, there are another 1 to 2 poached wolves that will not be found, that are not known that they were poached. So it's a concern anywhere. Oregon had a spate of wolf poachings for a number of years. And I think that they've had over 10 or 11 known wolf poachings over about a 7 or 8 year period. And I will tell you, we just caught wind today, just before I got on this podcast with you, that of another wolf that was found poached in Oregon in late September. And so that news will just be coming out. The wolf that you're talking about, OR 59, that was an Oregon wolf that came to California in December of 2018. And we know he came here because he had a radio collar on. That's why he was called OR 59. He was the 59th wolf to have been radio collared in Oregon. And when he showed up in California, he was spotted feeding on a calf. And the agency in California went up to investigate and determined that he had not killed the calf. In fact, the calf likely died of pneumonia and that he was simply scavenging on it. And word got out about that, but somebody obviously didn't care or didn't believe that, because within 1 week, he was illegally killed in California. So he's not the only wolf that has met a suspicious death in California. The Shasta Pack, which was confirmed here in 2015, 2 months later, were implicated in some livestock conflicts. And shortly after that, he disappeared, never to be seen again. This is 7-member, all black-furred pack of wolves, so pretty obvious. One of their offspring was observed about 8 months later on trail cam, and then in Nevada the following November, but he hasn't been seen since. We know who he is because his scat was collected and DNA tested. That's how we know that wolf was one of the Shasta Pack members. But the entire rest of the pack has disappeared, and many of us suspect that they may have been poisoned or somehow done away with. There is OR 54. The wolf I spoke about earlier, who came into California in January of 2018. In February of 2020, she was found dead. There has not been word yet of her cause of death. And I think you had asked if OR 59 cause of death or actually solving that case had happened. It hasn't been solved. They finally released information that he had been killed illegally about 13 months after he was discovered. We were one of the groups that put out a reward offer, but there's been no solving of that case. OR 54, we don't yet know her cause of death. It's under investigation. My strong presumption is that because we haven't heard anything yet, we will eventually receive a notification that the necropsy showed that she was killed illegally, but I can't vouch for that. I don't know. This is just my experience over the years of when you learn of a wolf being found dead and then you don't hear anything for a while. So in Washington, we also have poaching problems too.
Yeah.
Every year, numbers of wolves are illegally poached, and they rarely get solved.
Yeah, the Washington, I actually called. There was, I don't know if it was I want to say it was the wedge pack. So I don't know if that's right, and correct me if I'm wrong. But I mean, we can go right into Washington because I did some research on this too, because I did actually call when they eradicated the one of the packs that was there. There was a 12 wolf pack, and then they whittled it down to nothing, I believe, due to cattle depredation. And from what I understand, and please get into more detail about this, from what I was reading, what I've been hearing is that I don't know if it's split the same. It looks like it's actually split into 3 different sections in Washington. It looks like it's the northeast section, the whole western part of Washington, and then I think the southeast. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that's what I looked on their website for wolves, is like there's 3 different parts, and that there's too many, the pack distribution is not equal in what they're looking for. It's on I don't know if it's the Sierra Nevada, whatever mountain range runs up that way. They're trying to keep the wolf packs more so to the eastern side of the state, obviously away from the population centers or wherever the cattle graze on the western part. So is that part of the issue? Is that something that Washington isn't getting a handle on? From your perspective, since you've worked with, that's another one of the states that you're an advocate for. What seems to be, because it seems like we've sort of gone down. Like California's done a pretty good job. Oregon's next in line; they've done okay, and then Washington. What's the breaking point there in Washington, and why there's been so much, so much lethal wolf killing up there?
Washington wolf management is puzzling to those of us who live on the West Coast, because we consider the West Coast to be very progressive. And in fact, many of the citizens in the West Coast have very progressive attitudes towards wildlife, towards domestic animals as well. We have some of the most progressive protective laws in state statute in all 3 of these states. None of them are perfect. California has a lot of great laws to protect both domestic and wildlife animals. In Washington state, it's been a bizarre situation to watch, quite frankly, from both the position of a lens of a biologist and the lens of a former attorney, and looking at how policy is being made and what influences there are. So the problems we've seen with Washington go back to even the adoption of the state wolf plan. So that state has as its source population wolves from Idaho, but also wolves coming down from British Columbia, because that's immediately the border region above it. And Washington had also had most of its wolves eradicated, started to get wolves back in the 2000s in more numbers. In 2008, they got their first wolf pack confirmed. Starting in 2007, the state began to develop its own state wolf plan. It took about 4 years. It's a lengthier process. And the plan was put together, getting public input, but largely put together by their biologists within the state wildlife agency's species diversity program, which is their endangered species program. And as a result, their wolf plan actually was really robust. Great science in there for what was the current science at the time. Great understanding of wolf conservation needs. When the plan was adopted by the Wildlife Commission, which oversees the state agency, shortly after that, wolf management and the plan's implementation were yanked away from the endangered species staff and handed over to the agency's game management staff. Just think about that for a moment. You're a wildlife manager in an agency, and the lens through which you view the species you're supposed to be managing shifts from being a lens of how do we recover and protect this endangered species to the lens of, I'm hoping someday that this animal will be designated as a game animal so that people in the state can hunt it. And it really tilts the whole angle through which you're looking at how you handle situations on the ground, how you message to the public. If you're an endangered species manager, your messaging to the public will be more like, what an incredible conservation opportunity we have here. We didn't even have to reintroduce wolves. They're starting to come back on their own. What a great opportunity we have here to put the steps in place for people to coexist with the species we once tried to wipe from the face of the earth, versus the angle of how do we get wolves to a sufficient population where we can hunt them. And so the messaging shifted pretty quickly. You ended up with agencies, viewing wolves as an encroaching problem. You have the whole situation in any state where state agency funding, because they were largely set up to manage game species or fur bearers, animals that are hunted or trapped, most of their revenue, and this is true in any state, comes from people who pay license fees and permit fees to hunt or trap or angle, fish, that is. And so this becomes a customer base for the state agency. And if the agency is not recognizing that they actually represent and have a responsibility to conserve and manage a species for the entire population of the state, and not just the 3% of people in the state who hunt, trap, or fish, then the management actions you see come out of it are going to be very different than perhaps what that species needs to actually recover and thrive. So we have that going on in Washington. We have a lot of political pressure in Washington. For reasons I can't understand or explain, state legislators in northeastern Washington have a huge amount of sway in the state legislature. I'm aware of instances where Democrats in the state legislature were convinced to vote for bills that were bad for wolves because they had somehow been convinced that it was good for wolves. So you have that happening in the state legislature. You have the issue of the state commission, which oversees the agency. And again, this is a problem in just about every state, where you don't have people sitting on the commissions who actually have solid scientific credentials to be making conservation-oriented decision-making about any species, let alone an endangered or threatened species. They tend to be people who either come from the ranching community, the hunting community, the fishing community, as business people, not as scientists with science backgrounds, but, this is their business. And so the whole model becomes, what do we do to keep our businesses economically viable, as opposed to what do we do to keep these species on the track to recovery. So you have this whole collision, of course, of things happening. You have the agency developing a stakeholder group to implement its state plan and ignoring the science and instead using whatever the citizens come up with in their wolf advisory group. And with the wolf advisory group being so stacked with hunting and livestock industries and not as strongly loaded up with environmental interests, and not even having any further interest beyond that, you end up with really bad decisions coming out of the agency that are told to the public that, well, our wolf advisory group said that this is what we want to do. And yet it's not what wolves need. So what we've seen in Washington, going back to 2012, we've seen the agency repeatedly killing wolves for livestock conflicts when they have not implemented either any non-lethal measures to try to stop the conflicts, or they implemented measures, but they didn't implement them effectively, or they didn't implement the right measures, or they didn't implement them fully. And yet they present to the public that, well, we did all of these things. But when you get the public records from them, because you can make Public Records Act requests or through suing, you get agency records, you see that these things weren't done. And so we filed several lawsuits against the state for their wolf killing programs. And since 2012, they've killed now, I think, 34 wolves And the state currently has, the state also puts out an annual report every spring, and they put out the numbers that they manage. They give the estimates from the tribal reservations because the tribes manage wolves on their own in Washington. And so last year's report showed that there were 108 wolves and 21 packs in Washington that the state manages. And then on the reservation lands, there's an estimated additional 37 wolves and 5 packs. But so over the past 8 years, the state has killed 34 state endangered wolves. 90 to 95% of those have been killed on behalf of the same livestock operation who fails or refuses to use non-lethal measures or to use them effectively, yet the state still keeps after them. This summer, we had great success, actually last fall too, finally got the governor's attention on this issue. So many members of the public, probably members of your listening audience, helped write and call and email and fax the governor multiple times about all these problems. And so last fall, he put out a statement to the director of the agency saying that this repeated annual killing of wolves in Northeast Washington is simply unacceptable. You need to come up with some non-lethal measures and really focus on that. The agency ignored that. So this last spring, we filed an administrative petition with the commission asking them to develop enforceable rules that will hold the agency accountable, hold the ranchers accountable, and have consequences if they're not followed. And those consequences aren't that the wolves get killed. The consequences are that the wolves don't get killed. The commission denied our petition, and we filed a formal appeal with the governor. He granted it. So just this summer, he ordered the commission to start a public rulemaking process to allow more of the public and the science to come into the equation. And that's still going to be a battle too, because all of these things at the state level are just as much of a battle as they are at the federal level. But this is why we've seen this ongoing problem with Washington. Just a lot of missteps along the way, a lot of political pressure, a lot of actions at the state agency level that aren't in the best interests of wolves. And so they're not trying to keep them in Northeast Washington. There actually has been some talk about trying to translocate wolves to other parts of the state. So you had mentioned that in Washington, they divide the state into 3 areas. Yeah, I'll let you ask another question.
No, go ahead. Please talk about the translocation. That's what I was trying to get to. Go for it.
Yeah, so the state does divide, the wolf plan does divide the state into 3 regions, just like you described. There's a Eastern Washington region, then a North Cascades region, and then a Western region that's called North Coast and South Cascades. And so far, most of the wolves are living in the northeastern part of the state in the Eastern region. Some wolves are living in the central part of the state in the North Cascades region, but there are no wolf packs yet in the western part of the state, which would include the coast, the South Cascades, the Olympic Peninsula. A number of ranchers and politicians in Northeast Washington have been pushing to have wolves translocated from Northeast Washington over to the western side of the state. And in part, it's a political ploy because their view is, well, people in the west part of the state don't have to live with wolves. They shouldn't be telling us what we can and can't do with them. So let's get some wolves over there. It is a potential measure that the wolf plan allows, but I'll tell you that it's not something that we'd be in favor of for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's a problem in search of actually a solution in search of a problem. So wolves are starting to make their way west. This is why we do have wolves in the central part of Washington. They're coming down from British Columbia into the Cascades. Some wolves are making their way west over from the eastern part. It may take a little longer than was projected, but they will make their way over there. So there's that. Number two, it's a solution in search of a problem, again, because there really aren't that many livestock predations. You wouldn't know that if you live in wolf country. The headlines blare that there's all these problems, but percentage-wise, there's almost 1.2 million cattle in Washington, and there's less than 150 wolves there. And the amount of livestock predations amounts to something like 0.0000019%. The livestock die from so many other causes. So there's that. Then there's this piece. The research that's been done shows that the wolves that used to live in coastal Washington are more genetically related to the coastal wolves in British Columbia than they are to the wolves from the Northern Rockies. So the wolves that are coming into Eastern Washington are wolves from the Northern Rockies. If we want to translocate wolves to Western Washington and get them into the Olympic Peninsula, great. Let's go up to British Columbia. Let's work things out with the British Columbia government and translocate the wolf that once lived there. That seems like a more legitimate thing to consider. So, I think that the thoughts of translocating any wolves is premature. They're still in the early stages of recovery. And as long as they have protections in place, they can get there. I think what we have to worry about more is the protections being lifted.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I do want to touch on just one more thing, and then I have a question to ask you at the end. I mean, we spoke about the lethal, non-lethal argument. What are some of the things that you and your groups and the organizations that you've been working with that are trying to push? What are some of the non-lethal ways to keep wolves? We can all cohabitate together. What are some of the non-lethal measures that your groups are trying to push in all three of these states that can sort of be used uniformly across the West Coast?
One of the things that's helpful to understand is that there's no one size fits all, and that's because each livestock operation is different. So the first thing to consider before deciding what non-lethal measure or tool to use is, what are you looking at here? Is this a public grazing lands allotment that's hundreds of thousands of acres, tens of thousands of acres in size? Or are you looking at a small 800 acre or smaller than that 100 acre, 5 acre pasture next to somebody's residence that has fencing on it? So that can give you some idea. For instance, in the larger areas, what you would probably be using is range riding, which are humans on horseback who are out there monitoring the livestock. And this is a really tricky part. Livestock operators who have not lived with large predators for all the decades that wolves and grizzly bears have been gone are not accustomed to being out there monitoring their livestock all the time. Particularly if it's a public lands grazing situation, they put the animals out there at the beginning of the summer and they go haul them back in 6 months later, October, November, and hope that they got most of the animals still there. So the concept of having humans out there doing work is really kind of a foreign concept. So that's taking a bit of resistance to overcome, but it's really one of the best measures for those large scale operations. And the second piece of that is to realize that the job is not to monitor the wolves and where the wolves are. Even if you've been given radio color information from the agencies, your job is not to monitor the wolves. Your job is to monitor the livestock. Keep them in sight, keep them bunched up so they can act like a wild herd of ungulates normally acts. They don't spread out all over the countryside. They bunch up together so that they can defend themselves and defend their offspring. It also allows you to find those animals if they're injured, if they're sick. You need to be able to see them so that you can identify that and pull them off the range, because any sick or injured livestock is much more vulnerable to any predator, whether it's wolves or coyotes or not lions, which are already out there. So it's understanding how it's done and that it needs to be done consistently. And there's a couple of practitioners in Montana and Canada who have this whole herd concept management of also managing their livestock so that they're calm. I think we all grew up seeing those Westerns on TV where people are whooping it up and, running the cattle around. And, when they're not calm like that, it's hard for them to kind of keep a brain in their head and be thinking about being protective on their own. So some of it is just keeping your cattle calm so that way that you can observe them. If they're anxious, that might give you an indication there's a predator nearby. So it needs to be done correctly. If you're operating on a smaller piece of land that maybe has fencing, There's a lot of other things you can do. So, for instance, you can put fladry on the fence line. And fladry is these strips of like ripstop cording that are about 2 feet in length. They're hung along rope with a flagging length hung every foot or two. So you've got a whole string of these red flaggings hanging down, and you can affix that to a fence line that already exists. You can also affix it to an electrified fence line. We call it turbo fladry then. And what fladry does is it acts as a psychological barrier. For some reason, wolves don't like to cross under it. It looks really scary to see that stuff flapping in the wind. And so fladry can be good for up to around 60, 63 days. After a while, wolves will become desensitized to it, and they may try to cross under it, which is where the turbo fladry can help. So if they decide to cross under it, then they may get a zap from the electric fence, and they'll back away. But it's really only good for a couple months. But if you're only in a situation where you need protection for just a couple months, it's perfect. So if it's during the lambing season or the calving season, if you can put that around your lambing hens or your calving hens, that can be protective. If you have radio-collared wolves in the area, you can get what's called a radio-activated guard box, or RAG box for short. You put that on your fence line. You set it for how far away a wolf is before it will trigger the alarm on that box. You could set it for 500 yards away, 1,000 yards away, whatever you want. It picks up the signal, the approaching radio-collared wolf, and when it catches that signal, it sends off sounds like Apocalypse Now. It's got like a whole sound recording in it, so it's like explosions and helicopters. And it also has a data collection device inside. It records which wolf came in, what time of day did they come in, and did they come in more than once? Did the RAG box work for them or not? So it's a data collection system as well. But you can only do that if you have a pasture that's fenced, where you can put the RAG box and the speakers up. If you're working with sheep instead of cattle, instead of having range riders, what you need to have out there are shepherds, human shepherds with your band of sheep, and accompanying them, sheep herding dogs, sheep protecting dogs, not the herding dogs, but the livestock guardian dogs. And those are like Great White Pyrenees or Maremas or Anatolian shepherds, breeds that have been bred in Europe for centuries to ward off wolves and bears. And so those are used in this country as well. There's a lot more. There's a lot of innovative things that are happening. Biofence, where you take wolf urine and you sprinkle it along your fence line, because a wolf coming in is going to think, oh my God, there's another pack here already. I'm going back where I came from. There's a lot of different things that are being tried out. And I think that we're really only limited by our imagination.
Are there just simply winners and losers in this battle? Or is there a reality in which ranchers and the wolf population and whatever other business interests or agencies are involved can genuinely coexist in harmony, where neither side really has to sacrifice a disproportionate amount in order to blend? I mean, in your wildest dreams, what does that relationship look like in an ideal yet realistic story? Like, what's the best we can hope for in a logical world?
The best we can hope for involves, number one, understanding that wolves always have and always will need people to advocate for that. People get depressed over wins and losses, and so many losses. But, this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And I would like to have people hold in their head all of the incredible successes we have had with wolves. The fact that we got them listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. The fact that we did get recovery going in several places. The fact that almost every time U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has tried to strip wolves of protections, either a court has overturned their decision or the service withdrew their rule before they even made it permanent, realizing that the science just didn't match up. So I urge people to not get overly depressed and to realize that you are part of a gallant cause, and wolves will always need you. It doesn't mean you may not occasionally have to step out of the battle and refresh yourself And I don't know what that looks like. Painting some pictures, going for a picnic with your family, playing roller derby, whatever you need to do to rejuvenate yourself. But realize the wins that we make will always need to continue to be fought for, because these forces I talked about previously are not going away. I do think over the long haul, all they can do is hold off the tide, because as I described earlier, the support for wolves just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. We're also in a really crucial moment in our history of coexisting with all wildlife on the planet. We're in the middle of an extinction crisis, which is made worse by the climate change crisis. And so for anyone who wants to think about wildlife in utilitarian terms, how can I ensure that there's a planet for me to live on? It's important to think about making sure there's a planet for them to live on, because our fate is tied to theirs. So, next big step, I think, is understanding that, this is a long battle, but it's an even bigger battle than just for wolves. This is a battle for the human soul to understand that we are part of this whole tapestry, and we have the power to unravel it, but we also have the power to weave the pieces back in and make the fabric strong for everybody. Can people live with wolves? I believe that they can. I believe that what has to be overcome are these centuries of mythology. What has to be overcome is the misunderstanding and the misinformation that people have about them. It strikes me as really ironic that we allow to sleep on our beds and our children's beds every night dogs who, 3 million times a year send people to the ER with dog bites, right? But we're unwilling to live with the ancestor they broke off from 34,900 years ago, who does not cause this level of damage in our home, to our children, or even to our livelihoods. So it's, and yet it's not just these facts that are going to convince people, right? This is something at an emotional level. If people tell me that they can't live with wolves because their grandfather told them that wolves killed all their livestock, I'm not going to argue with them. Wolves probably did kill a lot of their livestock 2 or 3 generations ago, because in this country, we wiped out all the wolves' prey. We wiped out the bison, we wiped out the elk, we wiped out the deer. A lot of people don't realize that elk populations we have today are here because we reintroduced them. We introduced elk to California.
Yeah.
So not the Thule elk. The Thule elk was minuscule, and that population is starting to expand again because of recovery efforts. But we actually reintroduced Roosevelt and Rocky Mountain elk to California. So I'm not gonna tell somebody, no, your grandfather lied to you. Wolves didn't kill a fair amount of their livestock back then, but that was then. This is now. We have plenty of prey back for wolves now. And so it's overcoming whatever stories we grew up with. It's overcoming whatever stories we tell ourselves. It's overcoming whatever stories our friends say that we believe, because we haven't bothered to do the research ourselves.
Yeah.
And to the extent that organizations like yours and programs like this can help get information out to people, my hope is that they don't just listen to what I say and take it for face value. They listen to what I say and your other guests say and say, oh, that sounded really interesting. I'm going to check into that myself. And by the way, I would really urge people to go out and do a tracking course with Jim Halfpenny. Since you talked about him on as a guest, people will learn so much about wildlife tracking and being out in Yellowstone with Halfpenny. He's amazing. I still have a wolf track that I got, plaster cast that I made from a wolf track in Yellowstone from being out on a trip with Jim and his wife. And I think those experiences also tap into people's feelings in a way that begins to change their mind. So I think the work you're doing with Wolf Connection is a great example of that, where the experiences that people have translate into their body in a way that just facts alone don't. So what you're doing is incredibly important in changing that whole dynamic and that whole story as well. And I thank you for that.
We appreciate the thanks from you. And I always like to close with this last question before we get to all of the places where people can go and look up this information that you have divulged to us here today. Is when you hear the word wolf, what's something that comes to your mind?
Oh, haunting beauty. Just haunting beauty that transcends time. Wolves are just timeless. And if anyone has the opportunity to see a wolf firsthand, I usually tell them two things. If you can, very quietly bend down and pick up your camera. If you don't want to ruin that moment, don't pick up your camera. I guess it would be your cell phone these days. Just soak up that moment between you and that wolf, because what you are able to experience there is an episode of timelessness that most of us don't have a chance to experience in our lifetime.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Amaroq, please, I know you sent me a bunch of websites. If you can give people any social media handles that you have that people can follow you and your work, and then a couple of the main websites where they can go to follow up on some of this information for federal and maybe state protections and plans that are happening that you're involved with.
Yeah, hopefully you'll be able to post some of these, because I'm not going to be able to remember them all to recite them, but I'll just say overall, generally, our website at the Center for Biological Diversity is www.biologicaldiversity.org. And if you want to look for wolf stuff there, when you get to that website at the top, look for where it says species, click on that, then click on mammals. And then down in the lower right screen on the side, you'll see all our different mammal species we work on. You'll see for wolves, you'll see a general gray wolves category. You'll see wolves on the West Coast. You'll see Mexican wolves, red wolves, Alexander Archipelago wolves, and a whole range of those. And if you find that you're interested in wanting to take some of the actions that we do, because we do send out action alerts to people, and when your voice is needed to contact a governor or contact a commission or an agency, at the top of our main webpage, you go to this site that says actions or take action. And when you pop open that link, it will give you a whole drop-down menu of all of our pending actions that are happening right at that time. And if you take action on any single one of them, you will hereafter become a center supporter, and you will continue to get our alerts. And that's one way to know that you're automatically going to get our alerts, and then you will find out other issues you might want to be involved in. To get the state updates from Oregon, California, and Washington, I recommend that people go to the state agency web pages for wolves. And I'm not going to rattle off what those whole links are, other than to say, just type in California Department of Fish and Wildlife gray wolves, and that will get you the link to their gray wolf webpage. Same thing with Oregon, same thing with Washington. And once you get on their wolf web pages, you can sort through their various links to find. You can read their wolf plan. You can see what their advisories and alerts are of what has happened. A number of them have photograph and video sites you can see of wolves in that state, and other information as well. So those are good places to look.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Yeah. And I will have I will have those websites, those links, and any social medias I can drive in the description for the podcast. So those of you at the end, I'll have that in the description for everyone. Mm-hmm. Amaroq Weiss, thank you so very much for dispensing all the information with us today. I'd love to have you back.
I learned a ton today.
Yeah, we learned a ton from you. We appreciate all of your efforts. You are the epitome of a rock star in this space, and thank you for the continued hard work that you and your colleagues and your individuals with all your organizations are doing for wolves on this coast and throughout the country. We can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for being a guest on our podcast.
Yeah, we appreciate you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Absolutely. Howls to all of you out there, and we will speak with you all next time. Bye, everybody.